Resuming debate, the honourable member for Dufferin-Caledon. I should have known that. I've said it enough.
That's fine. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. As I rise for this third reading debate, I have to express my, deep disappointment at the inflammatory rhetoric that you hear from this Liberal government as they sort of desperately try to change the channel from the misery that they've brought to Canadians, whether it's the millions of Canadians visiting food banks, whether it's the 800,000 people in Ontario who have to rely on a food bank now. It would be the fourth largest city in Ontario, completely dependent on the food bank to survive. That's the result after 8 years of this Liberal government. So they try to change the channel about a principled decision by the Conservative Party to vote against this free trade agreement. And there are many reasons why to vote against this free trade agreement. Of course, we've talked about the fact that there is a reference to carbon price and carbon leakage. There is also the, as they like to call it, the polluter pay principle, that policies that those who pollute the environment should bear the cost of that pollution. And of course, most Liberals say that emitting carbon, therefore, is pollution. So as Ukrainians are in the middle of a war and they are trying to heat their homes, this government is saying that they are polluters because most Ukrainians are using carbon-based fuels to heat their homes. So we get to have a principled objection to this free trade agreement on that basis alone. And there are many other reasons why we would be opposed to this free trade agreement that we haven't debated in great detail, but there are. And opposition parties get to vote against what they consider to be bad legislation. They say, oh, it's no big deal, there's some references to carbon pricing and carbon leakage, but what will they do in the next trade agreement they try to sign, Madam Speaker? This is the first time this has ever been in a trade agreement, carbon pricing and carbon leakage. Is it in the free trade agreement with the European Union? No. Is it in CPTPP? No. Is it in our trade agreement with the United States? No. Is it in any other trade agreement that Canada has ever signed? No. So this is the first time they've put it into a trade agreement. And what will be the next time? Will they mandate a certain carbon tax within a trade agreement? That's what they're trying to do. They are desperately trying to entrench the carbon tax and their version of carbon pricing now into international trade agreements, and what will be the next step that they take on that. So we get to oppose that on principle. But the really despicable thing that's happened as a result of that, Madam Speaker, is that they suggest that this is somehow the Conservative Party not supporting Ukraine and in fact somehow supporting Vladimir Putin and Russia. That kind of rhetoric, that kind of toxic rhetoric is actually, it's quite despicable. They should be ashamed that they are using that kind of rhetoric for a very principled position that we've taken on this free trade agreement. And as we know, there are two other parties in this House that have supported this free trade agreement. So this is actually going to pass. Our vote will actually cause no harm to Ukraine as we voice our principled opposition to this Liberal government's obsession with carbon taxes and carbon pricing. Now, but when we look at...
Point of order, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Oh, seriously? Wow.
Order. I have recognized the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for a point of order. Let's hear what he's got to say.
Madam Speaker, as a member is not, if not directly, indirectly talking about how the Conservative Party has voted, and it was earlier ruled that you can't do that.
On the same point of order.
The same point of order, the Honourable Member Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Madam Speaker, these far-left mega disruptive tactics in the House have no place from this member, and he should be ashamed of himself. The member in question was talking about his own decisions, which the member has done, and the member says should be allowed. So again, I encourage these far-left importing tactics.
Again, I think we're starting to go down the road of what was order. From what I can see, we're starting to go down that road again. That was just ruled on earlier this morning based on all of the points of order that was being raised. I would just say that, I would recommend members go back and look at the rules of orders that we already have in place, and if they have a point of order, make sure that it fits within that point of order. That is, it is one that we can actually take in. The honourable member for Dufferin-Caledon.
Madam Speaker, the party that complains that points of order are disruptive stands up to bring a ridiculous point of order. I'll go back to my point, which is this. So the decision of myself as a Conservative to vote against this agreement, it's a principled decision, because I will not stand for trade agreements having carbon pricing and carbon taxes in, because next time, who knows what they're going to do with it. I get to do that. And as we know, this legislation is actually going to pass. So there's actually no harm that's being caused by that. But when you look at, for just one instance, what happened with the waiver for the export permit that this government granted for a gas turbine, that actually caused significant harm to Ukraine. We know this. And why do we know this? Because President Zelensky said it. He said, if a terrorist state can squeeze out such an exemption to sanctions, what exemptions will it want tomorrow the day after? It is dangerous not only for Ukraine, but for all countries of the democratic world. And President Zelensky called on this Liberal government to change its decision. So they say we should listen to President Zelensky on the trade agreement. We get to disagree with him on that. We think it's not a good trade deal, not good for Ukraine, not good for Canada. But somehow President Zelensky saying that they should not grant the export waiver and it's actually aiding Russia, that's no big deal. Nothing to see here. So their hypocrisy on this is really astounding. And then for them to turn a principled vote in the House of Commons against including carbon taxes, carbon leakage, carbon pricing in a trade agreement for the first time ever, that somehow is aiding Russia or Vladimir Putin. I think that language, not only is it despicable, it's completely unhelpful. It's unhelpful for the debate. It's actually them saying that we're supporting Russia is actually giving Russia some kind of a win. Now, we, of course, are not saying that. We're saying it's a terrible decision, and the decision actually helped Russia pump gas, which has helped fuel their war. Now, who said that? President Zelensky, who also said that, the Ukrainian ambassador. That's their words, not ours. So if we look at who's actually causing harm to Ukraine, it is this government by the decision to grant that export waiver. Now, many members here stand up and claim that we're doing terrible things to Ukraine as a result of our principled decision. Where were they on this decision, Madam Speaker? Where were they on that? They aren't there, which to me is deeply, deeply hypocritical. And Ukrainian Canadians know exactly which government, which party supported the export of that gas turbine. But if that was enough, Madam Speaker, I would say it's pretty bad, but, it's not absolutely awful. But when you look at what else has happened, we now have media reports that Canadian detonators are in Russian mines. Now, that is a complete lack of export control by this government. We know they're not very good at doing much, but to actually allow Canadian detonators to find their way, as media have reported, into Russian mines, that is inexcusable. And to somehow say that our vote, our principled vote against the bad things they put in this trade agreement is somehow aiding Russia and Vladimir Putin, but they exported a gas turbine that was used to pump Russian gas to fund the war, and Canadian detonators have found their way into Russian mines that are used during the war. I think if you compare these things, some things are desperately harmful to Ukraine, other things don't cause any damage whatsoever. Now, if that were enough, Madam Speaker, we would say, well, that's terrible, but it's not absolutely awful, is it? But guess what? There's more. There's actually more. Canada is the only G7 country that is not offering wartime insurance to businesses. Now, what does that mean? They say Canada's there to help rebuild Ukraine. Well, but they won't put wartime insurance in place for those businesses right now. So any businesses in Canada that want to help Ukraine during the war, they don't have wartime insurance. Every other G7 country has done it. Now, again, this causes real damage to Ukraine. And they have the audacity to say that our principled vote against the trade agreement is somehow aiding Vladimir Putin. No, these three things, these three decisions they made is exactly what's aiding the Russian war effort. So their hypocrisy on this is really stunning. Now, Madam Speaker, what we tried to do at committee was to actually improve the trade agreement. Now, one thing that the Ukrainian ambassador actually said recently was we could use in the future cooperation on energy security. And as we pointed out at the committee, there's nothing in this trade agreement on energy security. It's shocking. What they need is energy security. Why wouldn't they include a chapter on energy security? Well, I know the Liberals say, and all their proxies say, well, that's never been in a trade agreement before, so you can't put it in. Carbon pricing, carbon leakage was never in a trade agreement before either. Right. So very clearly, you can put things into trade agreements that have never been in there before. Now, they're going to say, well, why isn't it in there? Well, because when you negotiate a trade agreement, two sides decide what they're going to put in there. This Liberal government's priority was carbon taxes, carbon pricing, carbon leakage. We know the Ukrainians want energy security. The ambassador just said it recently on the news. So why wasn't there a chapter on energy security in the trade agreement? You have to only conclude it's because this Liberal government didn't want to put in anything in the trade agreement on energy security. You can come to no other conclusion. And Madam Speaker, we tried to fix that. We brought forward a motion at committee to expand the scope of what could be included in the review of this trade agreement to allow for, guess what? Yes, energy security. And guess how every single Liberal member on that committee voted? They all voted no, which is the exact opposite of what the Ukrainian ambassador was just asking for. So when you talk about what's causing harm, there is only one wrecking ball that's going through this, and it's the wrecking ball of the Liberal Party, because they exported the gas turbine, they won't grant wartime insurance, and Canadian detonators are finding their way somehow into Russian mines. So, look, I subscribe all of that to gross incompetence, because you see gross incompetence from this Liberal government on virtually every single thing they touch right now here in Canada. Now, if that was all, Madam Speaker, you could say again, well, you know, that's not such a big deal. But in fact, there were 8 amendments at committee, 8 amendments that we tried to improve the free trade agreement so that we could actually find a way to support it. In fact, Madam Speaker, one of the amendments that I put forward would have delayed the coming into force of the agreement until they removed the references to carbon pricing and carbon leakage. And if they had done that, well, I would have found a way to vote in favor of it. But again, they voted that down, like they voted down every single amendment that we put forward to make this trade agreement better, including to strengthen cooperation on matters relating to nuclear technology, including the export of Canadian nuclear equipment, expertise, and uranium to Ukraine. Ukraine has lost 50% of its electrician generating capacity as a result of this war from Russian bombing. So wouldn't it have been great to put in this free trade agreement cooperation on expanding nuclear capacity. Now, guess what? I know everyone's saying, well, surely they voted for that. It's what Ukraine needs. It's what the Ukrainian ambassador asked for. No, you would be wrong. They, of course, voted against it. So they want to include their ideological obsession with carbon pricing and carbon leakage, but they don't want to vote for cooperation in nuclear technology, cooperation on energy to provide energy security. Now, the other issue, of course, is this. There could have been cooperation on LNG capacity in Ukraine and increasing Canadian LNG exports because, as everyone knows, Russia's war machine is primarily funded by the exports of gas. Now, what did we do? I just want to explain a little bit. Ukraine is sitting on the third largest proven reserves of LNG in all of Europe. Imagine a Europe that is getting their LNG exclusively from Ukraine as opposed to getting LNG from Russia. Imagine if Ukraine got the revenues from being able to export LNG to Europe and to other parts of the world to help them fight the Russian invasion. This is a double win. It cuts off the blood money that's going to Russia, and it would increase the revenues of Ukraine. They would have more money to fight the war. So surely they voted for the trade agreement to include LNG cooperation, right? I mean, it's a win-win for everyone. No, they of course did not. They voted against it. Now, why did they vote against it, Madam Speaker? Again, because the Prime Minister and the Liberal Party has an ideological obsession with carbon taxes and carbon prices and carbon emissions, even to the detriment of a country in the middle of a war, a country fighting for its very survival. What's the most important thing for this Liberal government? Carbon tax, carbon price, carbon leakage. So even in this context, they can't get out of their obsession with the carbon tax, something that absolutely would have helped Ukraine. Now, to go on with some of the amendments that were put forward. Now, we put in an amendment on the donation of Canadian military equipment because we have equipment that is somewhat past its functional life, but it's not completely unusable. This could actually be exported to Ukraine, refurbished, so they could have more Canadian military equipment to help them in their war. Again, Madam Speaker, surely they voted for that because it's a direct benefit to Ukraine. No, of course, they did not. And then they have the audacity to say to us that our vote, that if we vote against this free trade agreement, somehow it's a win for Russia and Vladimir Putin. I mean, the hypocrisy is really, it's unbelievable. And there are more and more and more amendments that were put forward.
Because I do think it's important that we get a ruling.
Order. I didn't recognize anybody else except for the parliamentary secretary. If anybody else has to add something, they should wait until they see what the parliamentary secretary has to say.
I rise only because I do think it is important that we do get some sort of a ruling sooner as opposed to later. The member has now on a couple of occasions been reflecting on votes, whether they're in committee or here, and that is a concern I think that all members should be having.
Another point of order, the honourable member for Calgary Shepherd.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. On what the parliamentary secretary just said, a member is allowed to reflect on their own votes. And I don't believe that the standing orders in the House of Commons directly affect how committees have votes. I don't believe that has ever been part of the rules directly. Votes cannot be referred to in the House or are taken here. That should be part of the ruling that is made as well, whether we can refer to votes taken on committee, especially if they are a member's own votes, which a member is allowed to reflect on because it's part of the public record that should be public, and they can refer to it when speaking constituents and speaking in the House on it. That is what the member for Dufferin-Caledon was doing. If it wasn't for the interruption of the parliamentary secretary, I'm sure he would have finished by now.
On the point of order.
Sorry, I have another point of order. The honourable member Sherwood Parkford, Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll read very specifically from the standing order that I think the member is trying to refer to. This is Standing Order 18, the second half of it. no member may reflect upon any vote of the House, except for the purpose of moving that such a vote be rescinded. I think that makes fairly clear that reflecting on a vote of committee is not covered by the standing order.
So again, as we've indicated before, I appreciate the additional information that the honourable members have put forward. Come back to the House if need be. I do want to remind members that yes, they are not, according to the standing orders, they are not to reflect on votes that are in the House, that have been held in the House about other members. And so I will allow the honourable member from Dufferin-Caledon to continue his speech. He has just a little under about 4 minutes to continue.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. It's amazing to me the member who complains about points of order during his speech continues to rise to interrupt me when I'm giving my speech, to continue to talk about motions that were brought forward to try and make this trade agreement better. Again, a motion was brought at the committee in order for expanded munitions productions in Canada and increasing munitions exports to Ukraine, and to support the development of weapons and munitions manufacturing capabilities in Ukraine by Canadian industry. A country in the middle of a war that's using thousands of shells a day needs expanded munitions. So of course we brought forward this to say we want to directly support Ukraine, because despite the desperate attempts by the Liberal government to say, and Liberal members to say we don't support Ukraine, we absolutely do. And Madam Speaker, of course that motion was defeated with all Liberal members at the committee voting against it. So when you try to talk about actual support for Ukraine, Conservatives have put forward real motions, real amendments to actually help Ukraine, to improve the trade agreement to help Ukraine. We've done that. What this Liberal government has done is export a gas turbine, be so incompetent and negligent to allow for Canadian detonators to end up in Russian mines. They don't provide wartime insurance for Canadian businesses so they can help rebuild Ukraine, the only country in the G7 not to do it. And then they have the audacity to stand here and somehow suggest that we are supporting Vladimir Putin. I mean, it's a disgraceful comment to make. They should be ashamed of themselves for making it. But
I got a point of order. The honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
Well, I think it would be really shocking if the Liberals accused the Conservatives of supporting Vladimir Putin, but I think the issue was that they voted against Operation Unifier on 3 separate occasions.
Again, and that's a point of debate. The honourable member for Dufferin-Caledon.
So thank you very much, Madam Speaker. So what we find is that the hyperbole coming from the Liberals doesn't match reality. Their criticism is deeply hypocritical. We all know it. They have done things that have directly harmed and continue to directly harm Ukraine with their decisions. And I can tell you this, Madam Speaker, they have become the party of disinformation. Disinformation to suggest we don't support Ukraine, disinformation that somehow our opposition to this free trade agreement is not supporting Ukraine. We tried to make the trade agreement better so that we could support the trade agreement and, of course, support Ukraine. This Liberal government did everything they could to make sure that wasn't possible. Why? Because they want to use the trade agreement in a desperate attempt to score cheap political points here in Canada with an incredibly false narrative. Now, Madam Speaker, I move, seconded by the member for Calgary-Shepherd, that the motion be amended by deleting all the words after that and substituting the following. Bill C-57, an act to implement the 2023 Free Trade Agreement between Canada and Ukraine, be not now read a 3rd time, but be referred back to the Standing Committee on International Trade with the view to amend the coming into force provision to allow it to be fixed by order of the Governor and Council after the removal of all references to carbon pricing and carbon leakage.